Unit 4 will be all about the financial system and how the financial system impacts the overall economy through borrowing, lending, investment, etc. So in this first lesson of Unit 4, we want to look at exactly what it is we mean by financial system. How is it that the financial system connects our savings, or savings at a national level, to investment by firms, and also consumer borrowing and government borrowing. So we're going to start by going back to something that we talked about earlier in the semester, and that is this idea of the savings, investment, spending identity. And we may or may not have used those exact terms, but we have already talked about the fact that savings and investment are equal. When we talked about the circular flow diagram and the leakages and the injections, we talked about the correspondence between taxes and government spending, the correspondence between exports and imports, and we talked about the fact that savings was a leakage from the circular flow, but investment is an injection. We also talked about the fact that Keynes, if you recall, John Maynard Keynes, made the observation that money that leaves the circular flow through savings, all right, which is, as I said, a leakage, savings that money that leaves through savings may or may not become investment spending during that same year or even decade. Investment spending, he argued, is erratic, it's unpredictable, it's volatile. So while we know there is this identity between savings and investment, we also know that they are not necessarily always equal. But let's come back to this idea. The money that we save, the money that we put in a bank, represented here by a piggy bank, money we put in the bank is money that becomes available for others to borrow. And we're going to learn a lot more specifically about how that works, about how our banking system works, and about how borrowing and lending work. But for now, we'll just say that savings money becomes available to borrow. And one of the big borrowers is going to be firms. And firms are going to borrow in order to finance their investment spending, which, as we've talked about for the entire semester, is the spending on new capital goods. But one thing that's a little bit confusing in Unit 4, and especially as you watch some of the Marginal Revenue University videos, is that they start to use the word investment the way you've probably heard it before, like stocks and bonds and personal finance. So it's going to be important to keep track in your mind of when we're talking about financial investment done by individuals for the purpose of trying to earn return with the purchase of things like stocks and bonds. That is very different from this economic term, investment. So I realize it's a little bit confusing, but we can't really get away from it. All right, so savings equals investment spending. Now let's look at this a little bit more precisely. Disposable income that households have, meaning the income that you have after taxes, right? After you've already paid your income taxes, your disposable income can be spent just two ways: consumption and savings. And our MPC, right, predicts how much of it will go to consumption, and our MPS predicts how much of it will go to savings. So those are the two choices facing households. This, the sum of all the money that all, for example, Americans, or this would be true for another country too, let's say all Americans' private domestic savings is all sitting in, potentially in banks, probably some of it's not, but most of it's in banks, and that becomes our part of our national savings. We would add to that our government budget balance, meaning if our government had a surplus. So if our government was actually saving, if it was collecting more in tax revenue than it is spending, we would add that. As it is, of course, we have to subtract the government budget balance, right? That becomes a negative. So let's say that our private domestic savings is 1 million. We're just going to use a really small number so I don't have to write too many zeros. And our government budget balance is, let's say, minus 30,000, right? Then our national savings is going to be the difference between those two, right? So it'd be $970,000. So obviously that's a very small amount. It'd be a very small country, right? But that would be the national savings. If in fact the government ran a surplus of positive 30,000, then our national savings would be 1,030,000. So depending on what the government budget looks like, that might be a positive or negative number. And then we have one more thing that gets factored in before we add up this national savings, and that is capital inflow. And we talked about this in Unit 1. Remember, we talked about how individuals who have extra money, potential savings, who live in other countries, might want to put their money in our banks if our interest rates are higher. So high interest rates are going to attract capital inflow, and that money that comes in is going to be added in. So we have our savings, our government budget balance, and capital inflow, and that becomes the total funds available for investment. So even though Americans don't save very much, right? We're not particularly good at this. So we don't save very much, right? And our government runs deficits, okay, rather than running surpluses. But we have a lot of capital inflow because there are a lot of people in other countries who want to put their money in our banks, even though we have low interest rates, because our banks are seen as very stable and because our government is seen as very stable. So we have lots of capital inflow that makes up for our lack of savings and our budget deficit. Not every country is this lucky. If you go to most countries in the world, they rely primarily on their own private domestic and savings for investment. They might have a small budget surplus, but most countries run budget deficits and they don't have a lot of capital inflow. So in a lot of countries, savings literally equals investment. But we have it a little bit easier because people are willing to send money our direction. So let's go back to this. Surely you still have this expanded circular flow diagram. And when we first looked at it, right, and we talked about the fact that we have government plus consumption plus investment, meaning buying capital or stockpiling inventories, and net exports, right? And that's our GDP. And we talked about how the small circular flow is inside here, right? Firms are paying wages, rents, interest, and profit for the use of households' resources like land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Households then use their generated income to pay taxes, right? And to save and to spend on consumption. And the consumption spending becomes the primary, right, about 70% of spending on GDP. So we're just going to look back at this now and just look primarily at the financial market. So this private savings that we talked about, this private savings enters the financial market. And then we also have potentially, sorry, my pen is being a little slow to catch up. We have potentially money coming from the government as well. Right? We have this government, it says here government borrowing because our government's running a deficit. But if this was a surplus, that would be entering the financial markets as well. And then we have this. This is capital inflow, foreign lending and purchases of stock. So lending includes if people in another country are basically putting money in our banks that we can directly borrow. It also includes bonds, as you're going to learn about watching one of the Marginal Revenue University videos. So potentially we could have, if there was a government budget surplus, that would be added, and this capital inflow. So those are the three sources of money that flow into financial markets. And then, of course, we have multiple ways that this money flows back out. So some of it is borrowed by individual households, right? And that doesn't really show up very well on this particular diagram. We might want to make it too complicated, but we have government borrowing, and we have firms borrowing, right, to finance investment. And then we also have foreign borrowing because people in other countries can also borrow from our financial markets. So that's the connection. We have lots of borrowers and we have lots of savers. And the whole existence of the financial industry is to connect these, right? The whole point of the financial industry is to connect the borrowers with savers. So you and I, consumers, people on Main Street, become involved with Wall Street, the financial system, anytime we buy any kind of what is called a financial asset. So first of all, let's stop back for a second and see what is an asset. And an asset is anything that you own of value. Many of the things people own are physical assets, like a house or a car or fine jewelry or artwork or collection of baseball cards, right? Those are all physical assets. Financial assets are cash, right? That's a financial asset, and also claims to future income. So if you make a loan to somebody, that's a financial asset. If you buy a bond, it's a financial asset. If you buy stock, it's a financial asset. So financial assets, anytime we do anything like put money in a bank, okay, if we just save in a bank, we have now purchased essentially a financial asset. Another would be like a certificate of deposit. Anytime we put something in a bank, or interact with the financial industry as a saver, we're buying a financial asset. And then anytime we borrow, right, we are incurring a financial liability. So if you borrow money for a car or for college or for a house, right, those are all ways that you interact with the financial system as well. So there's 4 types of financial assets that individuals generally buy, and I'm not going to go through these in detail. There is a Marginal Revenue University video that talks about loans in general. There's a specific one on stocks and there's one on bonds. And we can come back and talk about loan-backed securities later. That's a very specific, certainly not on the AP test. It's interesting to understand, but it's very specific to the causes of the housing crisis. So we can come back and talk about that later. So if the financial system is all about just connecting savers, right, to borrowers, it seems like we could do that pretty simply on our own, right? You could just have a borrower go to a saver and say, can I borrow some of your money? And sure, I'll lend you the money. Okay, but that's a very risky way to do it, because if I lend you $100,000 and you don't pay me back, I just lost, a significant portion of my net worth. So part of the idea of our financial system is to pool lots and lots of savers so that lots and lots of borrowers can borrow from them and no one person assumes all the risk. So the financial system has evolved over hundreds of years in the United States and globally to reduce transaction costs, which means to make it easier for people to get loans. So somebody living in Lexington, Kentucky, if there's no one in Lexington who wants to lend to them, they can have access to money that somebody's saving in New York or California. It makes it a lot easier for lots and lots of people to be able to borrow money. Also to reduce the risk by spreading it out over more people, right? Like more borrowers essentially have their money pooled together to be able to not take a risk on just one lender. And then also to provide something called liquidity, which we'll talk about a number of times in this unit. But liquidity means essentially access to cash and cash flow. Think of liquidity like actual liquid, like water, right? If an asset is not liquid, a house, for example, is not a liquid asset, that means it's more like an ice cube. You can't drink it. But cash is very liquid because you can spend it. And so our financial system allows a lot of access to cash. And just one quick example, a house is not a liquid asset. But because we have a very sophisticated financial system and property rights system, it's relatively easy in the United States for someone to borrow money against their house. And that might provide them money for starting a business or sending a child to college. But in many countries around the world, that is not possible. You don't even necessarily have property rights in your home, let alone a bank that's willing to take that risk to provide you cash on something that is a hard physical asset. So our financial system makes it a lot easier for us to be able to lend without high risk, to be able to borrow and have liquid cash, and to reduce those transaction costs about as low as they can be. The financial intermediaries, and there's a lot of them, okay, try to reduce the risk even further through diversification. So you're going to watch the videos and learn a little bit about stock markets and bond markets, but these other intermediaries exist. For example, mutual funds help people pool in order to buy stock. So it reduces the risk further because you don't have to buy just one stock. Okay, and others of these funds work the same way. So we can discuss those a little bit in class. Hopefully you have a good understanding and overview of what the financial system itself is.